The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Catherine stood at the sink, her hands trembling slightly as she washed the same plate for the third time. William sat at the breakfast table behind her, scrolling through his phone and occasionally glancing up at her back. Something felt different about the way she moved, the way she held her shoulders. There was a heaviness in the air that he couldn't quite place. Catherine had always been the type of person who filled silences with gentle chatter, asking about his day, sharing stories from work, or planning their weekend activities. But today, she remained quiet, methodical in her movements as she dried each dish and placed it carefully in the cabinet. The only sounds were the gentle clinking of ceramic and the distant hum of traffic outside their apartment. William finally looked up from his phone, really looked at her, and noticed how she seemed to be memorizing every detail of their small kitchen. Her fingers traced the edge of the counter as she moved, her eyes lingering on the coffee maker they had bought together last Christmas, the small herb garden she had started on the windowsill. There was something almost ceremonial about the way she was cleaning, as if she was saying goodbye to each familiar object. He wanted to ask if everything was okay, but something held him back. Maybe it was the fear of breaking whatever fragile moment this was, or perhaps he sensed that once he asked the question, everything would change. So he sat in silence, watching the woman he loved move through their shared space like a ghost already halfway between worlds. Catherine turned off the water and stood perfectly still for a moment, her back still to him. William could see her shoulders rise and fall with each careful breath she took. When she finally turned around, her eyes met his briefly before looking away. And in that split second, he saw something that made his chest tighten with an inexplicable dread. She smiled at him then, but it wasn't her usual warm smile. This one was different, sadder, like someone trying to be brave. She walked over to him and gently placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch lingering just a moment longer than usual. Without saying a word, she leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to the top of his head, her lips staying there for what felt like an eternity. When she straightened up, William reached for her hand, but she was already moving away, heading toward their bedroom. He heard the soft sound of drawers opening and closing, the quiet rustle of fabric. Part of him wanted to follow her, to ask what was happening, but something in her demeanor told him to wait, to give her space for whatever she was working through. The apartment fell into an unusual quiet, broken only by the sounds of Catherine moving carefully through their bedroom. William found himself straining to hear, trying to understand what she was doing without actually going to see. There was something both intimate and heartbreaking about this strange morning routine, as if they were both participants in a dance neither of them fully understood. When Catherine emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later, she was dressed simply but beautifully, in a way that reminded William of their first date. She had taken extra care with her appearance, and yet there was something resigned about her posture, something that spoke of difficult decisions already made. She moved through the living room slowly, her eyes taking in their shared memories displayed on shelves and walls. The photo from their trip to the mountains, the book they had been reading together, the throw blanket they always fought over playfully during movie nights. Her fingers touched each item briefly, as if she was imprinting them in her memory. William watched all of this with growing unease, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. He wanted to break the silence, to demand answers, but something about Catherine's behavior made him feel like an observer rather than a participant. She seemed to be moving through a script he hadn't been given, playing out scenes he didn't understand. Finally, Catherine returned to the kitchen and began making tea, their usual morning ritual. But even this felt different today. She prepared 2 cups as always, but the way she handled each step seemed deliberate, meaningful. When she brought his cup to him, her fingers brushed against his as she handed it over, and he noticed how cold her hands were despite the warm morning. They sat together at their small table, drinking their tea in a silence that felt both comfortable and loaded with unspoken words. Catherine kept glancing at him, her eyes soft but distant as if she was trying to memorize his face. Every few moments she would open her mouth as if to speak, then close it again, leaving William with the growing certainty that something significant was about to happen. The tea grew cold between them as they sat in this strange, suspended moment, both of them aware that their morning routine had transformed into something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to an ending. Catherine set down her teacup with unusual care, the small sound seeming to echo in the quiet apartment. William watched as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges worn as if she had been carrying it for days. Her hand shook slightly as she placed it on the table between them, but she didn't slide it toward him. Instead, she simply left it there, like a bridge neither of them was ready to cross. William stared at the paper, his heart beginning to race. The way Catherine was looking at it, then at him, told him everything he needed to know about its importance, even though he couldn't bring himself to reach for it yet. There was a finality in her movements that made his mouth go dry. A sense that once he read whatever was written on that paper, there would be no going back to the comfortable morning they had shared just minutes ago. Catherine stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor in the silence. She moved to the window and looked out at the street below, watching the early morning commuters hurrying past with their coffee cups and briefcases. William wondered if she was imagining herself among them, walking away from this apartment, from this life they had built together. The thought made him feel sick. He finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. He asked her what the paper was, but Catherine didn't turn around immediately. She continued to watch the street, her reflection visible in the glass, and he could see that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. When she did turn to face him, she tried to smile, but it crumbled before it could fully form. Catherine told him that she had been thinking for weeks, trying to find the right words, the right time, the right way to say what needed to be said. She had written and rewritten the letter countless times, each version feeling inadequate for the magnitude of what she was trying to express. How do you explain to someone you love that loving them isn't enough anymore? How do you make someone understand that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is leave? William felt the world tilt slightly around him. He reached for the paper with trembling fingers, but Catherine was faster. She moved back to the table and placed her hand gently over his, stopping him from opening the letter just yet. Her skin was warm now, warmer than it had been earlier, as if her decision had brought some kind of heat back to her body. She began to speak then, her voice quiet but steady. She told him about the nights she had lain awake beside him, listening to his peaceful breathing while her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't share. She spoke about feeling like she was drowning in their routine, suffocating under the weight of expectations she had placed on herself to be happy, to be enough, to be the person he deserved. Catherine explained that it wasn't about him, not really. He was wonderful, kind, everything any woman should want. But somewhere along the way, she had lost herself in their relationship, had become so focused on being what he needed, that she had forgotten who she was when she was alone. She had tried to ignore the feeling, to push through it, but it had only grown stronger with each passing day. William listened in stunned silence, his hand still trapped under hers on the table. He wanted to argue, to tell her they could work through whatever this was, but something in her expression told him that this wasn't a problem to be solved. This was a decision that had already been made, probably weeks ago, and she was simply telling him about it now. She talked about their shared dreams, the apartment they had decorated together, the future they had planned with such careful optimism. She acknowledged that these things were beautiful, that their love was real and deep and meaningful, but she also explained that she had realized she needed to find out who she was outside of their relationship, outside of the comfortable patterns they had fallen into. Catherine's voice broke slightly when she mentioned the trip they had planned for next month, the wedding invitation that had arrived last week, all the small future moments that she wouldn't be part of. She apologized for the timing, for the confusion she knew this would cause, for the pain she was about to inflict on someone who had done nothing wrong except love her completely. William finally managed to ask her when she had decided, and Catherine's answer hit him like a physical blow. She told him it had been building for months, but the final decision had come 3 days ago, when she realized she had been pretending to be happy for so long that she had forgotten what genuine happiness felt like. She had woken up beside him and felt nothing but a deep, aching emptiness that she knew couldn't be filled by staying. The letter, she explained, contained everything she couldn't say out loud, all the gratitude and love and regret that was too big for spoken words. She had written it as much for herself as for him, a way to make sense of feelings that had seemed impossible to articulate. Reading it would hurt, she warned him, but it would also help him understand that this wasn't about failure or inadequacy, but about two people who had simply grown in different directions. Catherine squeezed his hand one last time before letting go, and William felt the loss of her touch like a preview of all the losses to come. She moved away from the table again, this time heading toward the door, and he realized with growing panic that she was actually leaving, that this conversation was her goodbye. William shot up from his chair so quickly that it nearly toppled over behind him. The sudden movement seemed to startle Catherine, who had been reaching for her coat by the door. She turned to face him, and for a moment they stood frozen in their small living room, looking at each other across a distance that felt impossibly vast, despite being only a few feet apart. He began to speak rapidly, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He told her they could talk about this, that whatever she was feeling could be worked through if they just tried. He reminded her of all their good times, their inside jokes, the way they fit together perfectly on their small couch during movie nights. His voice cracked as he mentioned their plans for the summer, the vacation they had saved for, the life they were building together brick by brick. Catherine listened with tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, but she didn't move closer to him. Instead, she seemed to shrink into herself, wrapping her arms around her body as if trying to hold herself together. She shook her head slowly, sadly, and told him that she had already considered all of these things. She had spent sleepless nights weighing their beautiful memories against her growing sense of emptiness, and the math simply didn't add up to staying. William felt panic rising in his chest like floodwater. He couldn't understand how someone could just decide to leave a good relationship, a loving partnership, a shared life that had felt solid and real just this morning. He asked her if there was someone else, if she had fallen in love with another person, and the question seemed to cause her physical pain. Catherine's face crumpled, and she told him that in some ways that would be easier to explain. An affair, a betrayal, a clear reason for leaving would give them both something concrete to point to. But this wasn't about another person. This was about her relationship with herself, about feelings she couldn't name or fix or simply decide to stop having. She tried to explain it differently, telling him about the woman she used to be before they met. She described someone who took long walks alone, who made impulsive decisions, who stayed up late reading poetry and felt deeply connected to her own thoughts and desires. Somewhere in the comfort of their relationship, that woman had quietly disappeared, replaced by someone who was pleasant and accommodating but fundamentally empty. William argued that people change in relationships, that compromise and growth were natural parts of love. He pointed out that he had changed too, had given up some of his independence to build something with her. But Catherine gently corrected him, explaining that what she was describing wasn't healthy change or compromise. It was a kind of slow disappearing, a gradual erasure of her essential self that she hadn't even noticed happening until it was nearly complete. She moved to their bookshelf and pulled out a journal, one William had seen her writing in occasionally but had never asked about. Catherine held it against her chest and told him that she had been documenting her feelings for months, trying to understand why she felt so disconnected from her own life. Reading back through her entries had been like watching someone slowly drowning in plain sight. The journal contained page after page of her trying to convince herself to be grateful, to appreciate what they had, to find joy in their routine, but it also contained her growing awareness that gratitude wasn't the same as happiness, and that staying in a relationship out of obligation rather than genuine desire was unfair to both of them. William begged her to let him read some of the entries, to help him understand what he had missed, what signs he should have seen, but Catherine held the journal tighter and explained that sharing it wouldn't change anything. The problem wasn't that he had failed to notice her struggles. The problem was that she had become so good at hiding them, even from herself, that by the time she recognized what was happening, the damage was already done. She set the journal down on the coffee table and moved toward him slightly, close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Catherine told him that leaving felt like the only honest thing she could do, the only way to stop pretending and start figuring out who she actually was. She needed to remember what it felt like to miss someone, to make decisions based entirely on her own wants and needs, to be alone with her thoughts without feeling guilty about them. William reached for her hands, and this time she didn't pull away. Her fingers were cold again, and he wrapped his hands around hers, trying to warm them. He told her he loved her, that he would wait for her to figure things out, that they could take a break instead of ending everything completely. The offer hung in the air between them, desperate and loving and ultimately futile. Catherine squeezed his hands and told him that she loved him too, deeply and truly, which was exactly why she couldn't ask him to wait. She explained that she had no idea how long it would take her to find herself again, or if the person she discovered would still be compatible with the life they had built together. It wouldn't be fair to keep him in limbo while she embarked on a journey with no guaranteed destination. The apartment felt smaller with each word she spoke, as if their shared space was contracting around them. William looked around at their belongings, their photos, their carefully chosen furniture, and realized that all of it would soon be just his. The thought was so overwhelming that he had to sit down on their couch, the same couch where they had spent countless evenings planning their future together. Catherine sat down beside William on the couch, maintaining a careful distance between them that felt both respectful and heartbreaking. She reached for the remote control and turned on their old television, letting the familiar morning news fill the silence that had become too heavy to bear. For a few minutes they sat together watching weather reports and traffic updates, pretending this was just another ordinary morning in their shared life. William found himself memorizing everything about this moment. The way Catherine tucked her feet under herself, the sound of her breathing, the faint scent of her shampoo that still lingered in the air between them. He realized he was trying to capture details he had stopped noticing years ago, all the small intimacies that had become background noise in their comfortable routine. Catherine muted the television and turned to face him more directly. She began to share memories, speaking softly about their first apartment together, how excited they had been to pick out dishes and debate paint colors. She reminded him of the night they had assembled their dining room table together, laughing until they cried when they realized they had put it together upside down and had to start over. She talked about their second Christmas together, when they had been too broke to buy expensive gifts but had spent hours making things for each other. William had written her a series of love notes and hidden them throughout the apartment for her to find over the following weeks. Catherine had learned to knit specifically to make him a scarf, even though it had turned out comically lopsided and too long. These memories seemed to cause Catherine both joy and pain as she recounted them. William could see that she wasn't sharing them to be cruel, but rather to acknowledge that their relationship had been real and meaningful, that her decision to leave didn't diminish the value of what they had built together. She was honoring their shared history, even as she prepared to step away from it. William asked her about practical things then, his mind grasping for concrete details that might make this feel more manageable. Where would she go? How would they divide their belongings? What about their shared bank account, their lease, their car? Catherine answered each question patiently, explaining that she had been planning these logistics for weeks, trying to make the transition as smooth as possible for both of them. She had already spoken to her sister about staying in the guest room temporarily while she looked for her own place. She assured him that she only wanted to take her personal belongings and a few items that held special meaning for her. Everything else, all the furniture and shared possessions they had accumulated, could remain with him. She knew this would be difficult enough without fighting over material things. Catherine pulled out her phone and showed him a list she had made, outlining which bills would need to be transferred to his name alone, which subscriptions could be canceled, which mutual friends she planned to tell about their separation and when. The level of detail in her planning made William's heart sink further. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a temporary crisis. This was a carefully considered exit strategy. She explained that she had already given notice at her job, that she planned to take some time to travel and think before settling into a new routine. Catherine had some savings of her own that would allow her this freedom, money she had been quietly setting aside not in preparation for leaving, but simply out of habit. Now it would fund her journey toward rediscovering herself. William felt a flash of anger then, asking her why she had made all these plans without talking to him first. How could she decide to dismantle their entire life together without giving him a chance to be part of the solution? Catherine accepted his anger with grace, explaining that she had tried many times to bring up her feelings, but had always lost courage at the last moment. She reminded him of conversations they had started but never finished, moments when she had seemed distant or distracted, times when she had tried to explain that she felt lost but hadn't known how to articulate it clearly. Catherine acknowledged that she could have tried harder to communicate, but also gently pointed out that part of her problem was feeling unable to voice her own needs even to herself, let alone to him. The anger drained out of William as quickly as it had come, replaced by a profound sadness that seemed to settle into his bones. He realized that Catherine was right. that there had been signs he had chosen not to see, conversations he had steered away from because they made him uncomfortable. He had been so focused on maintaining their happiness that he had ignored her unhappiness. Catherine reached over and took his hand again, her touch gentle and familiar. She told him that she didn't blame him for any of this, that he had been a wonderful partner who had done nothing wrong. The failure wasn't in their love for each other, but in her inability to maintain her sense of self within that love. Some people, she explained, were better at balancing individuality with partnership, but she had discovered that she wasn't one of them. She asked him if he understood, if any of what she was saying made sense to him. William nodded slowly, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. He could see the logic in her explanation, could even admire her courage in choosing the difficult path of honesty over the easier path of continuing to pretend. But understanding her reasons didn't make the prospect of losing her any less devastating. Catherine glanced at the clock on their wall, and William realized that she was working within some kind of timeline. Perhaps her sister was expecting her, or she had other arrangements to finalize. The mundane reality of logistics intruding on this profound emotional moment felt almost surreal, like planning a funeral while the person was still alive and sitting beside you. Catherine stood up from the couch and walked to their bedroom, and William heard the soft sound of a suitcase being zipped closed. The reality of her departure became more concrete with each small sound. Drawers closing for the last time, hangers clicking as she removed her clothes, the gentle thud of books being packed away. He wanted to follow her, to see what she was taking and what she was leaving behind, but his legs felt too heavy to move. When she returned to the living room, she was carrying a single suitcase and a small box that William recognized as containing her most precious keepsakes. Photos from her childhood, letters from her grandmother, the jewelry her mother had passed down to her. The sight of these items, things that had been part of their shared space for so long, now packed away and ready to leave, made everything feel brutally final. Catherine set her belongings by the door and returned to sit with him one more time. She began to talk about the future, both his and hers, painting pictures of possibilities that felt impossible to imagine in his current state of shock. She told him that she believed he would be happier than he could imagine right now, that he would find someone who could love him without losing herself in the process. She described her hopes for him, that he would take up photography again, the hobby he had abandoned when their relationship became more serious, that he would travel to Ireland, the trip he had always talked about but never planned, that he would learn to cook more than just pasta and sandwiches, maybe even take the cooking classes he had joked about taking. These suggestions felt like gifts and wounds simultaneously, evidence of how well she knew him and how much she cared about his future happiness. Catherine also shared her own tentative plans, speaking carefully as if she didn't want to seem too excited about a future that didn't include him. She mentioned the possibility of returning to school, maybe studying art therapy or social work, fields she had been interested in before they met but had never pursued. She talked about wanting to learn Spanish, to volunteer somewhere meaningful, to write in her journal without apologizing to herself for taking the time. William listened to these plans and realized that Catherine had been carrying dreams and desires he had never known about. He wondered how many conversations they had never had, how many parts of herself she had kept private, not out of secrecy, but out of a gradual forgetting that those parts of her even existed. The thought that he had shared a life with someone he apparently didn't fully know was almost as painful as losing her. She reached for the letter on the table and pressed it into his hands, her fingers wrapping around his briefly. Catherine told him not to read it immediately, to wait until after she had gone and he had some time to process everything they had discussed. The letter, she explained, contained things that were too difficult to say out loud, expressions of love and gratitude that would only make this moment harder if spoken. Catherine stood up again, and this time William knew she wouldn't be sitting back down. She walked through their apartment one more time, touching surfaces and looking at photos, taking mental pictures of the life she was leaving behind. At their kitchen table, she paused and adjusted the salt and pepper shakers, a small gesture that seemed to symbolize her need to leave things in order. She stopped in front of their bookshelf and pulled out a novel they had been reading together, a book club selection they had promised to discuss over dinner next week. Catherine placed it on the coffee table beside her journal, explaining that she couldn't take it with her because it belonged to both of them. to conversations they would never have and opinions they would never share. William finally found the strength to stand and move toward her. He asked if he could hug her goodbye, and Catherine nodded, stepping into his arms with a familiarity that made his chest ache. They held each other for a long moment, and he could feel her crying silently against his shoulder. Her body felt smaller than he remembered, as if she had been slowly disappearing even before this conversation. When they separated, Catherine wiped her eyes and gave him one last smile, this one more genuine than any of the others that morning. She told him that she would always love him, that he had taught her what it meant to be truly cared for, and that knowledge would help her figure out how to care for herself. She promised that someday, when enough time had passed, she hoped they could be friends again. She picked up her suitcase and box, took one final look around their shared space, and moved toward the door. William followed her, his body moving automatically even though his mind felt completely disconnected from reality. At the threshold of their apartment, Catherine turned back to him and said goodbye, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. William watched from their doorway as she walked down the hallway toward the elevator. She didn't look back, and he was grateful for that small mercy. When the elevator doors closed and he could no longer see her, he continued standing there, listening to the mechanical sounds of her descent, knowing that each floor marked another step away from the life they had shared. The hallway fell silent, and William realized he was alone in a way he hadn't been for years. He stepped back into their apartment and closed the door, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden emptiness. The space looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but everything felt different, charged with absence and the lingering presence of someone who was already becoming a memory. William stood in the middle of their living room, surrounded by the remnants of their shared life, feeling completely lost. The apartment seemed both too quiet and too full of echoes from their conversation. Every object around him held memories now tinged with the knowledge that Catherine had been slowly suffocating while he remained, oblivious to her pain. He walked to the kitchen and saw the 2 teacups still sitting on the table, hers with lipstick marks on the rim, his barely touched and now cold. The normalcy of these small details felt surreal against the magnitude of what had just happened. William found himself washing both cups carefully, as if completing their morning routine could somehow undo everything that had followed. The letter lay on the table where Catherine had left it, and William stared at it for a long time without touching it. Part of him wanted to tear it open immediately, desperate for any additional insight into her decision, while another part feared that reading her written words would make her absence feel even more permanent. He decided to honor her request to wait, though he moved the letter to the coffee table where he could see it from anywhere in the room. William began to notice the spaces where Catherine's belongings used to be. The empty spot on the bookshelf where she kept her favorite novels, the absence of her coffee mug from the kitchen counter, the bare section of closet visible through their open bedroom door. These gaps seemed to multiply as he looked around, each one a small reminder of how thoroughly their lives had been intertwined. He found himself replaying their entire relationship in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed. William remembered times when Catherine had seemed distant or distracted, moments when she had started to say something important, but then changed the subject. He began to wonder if he had been willfully blind to her unhappiness, so invested in their comfortable routine that he had stopped really seeing her. The phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. It was his mother, calling for their usual weekend check-in, and William realized he would have to start telling people about the separation. The thought of explaining Catherine's decision to friends and family felt overwhelming. How could he make others understand something he barely comprehended himself? He let the call go to voicemail and walked to their bedroom, where the evidence of Catherine's departure was most visible. Her side of the dresser was empty, her bedside table cleared of the books and photographs that had lived there for years. The closet held only his clothes now, hanging with extra space between them that made them look lonely and sparse. William sat on their bed and picked up Catherine's pillow, breathing in the faint scent of her shampoo that still lingered on the fabric. He wondered where she was right now, whether she was already at her sister's house or still in transit. The thought that she was out there somewhere beginning her new life without him felt impossible to accept. He remembered their last vacation together, just 2 months ago, when they had spent a week at a small cabin by a lake. Catherine had seemed relaxed and happy then, reading on the dock while he fished, cooking simple meals together in the tiny kitchen. William tried to reconcile that version of Catherine with the woman who had just walked out of his life, searching for signs of discontent he might have overlooked. The day stretched endlessly ahead of him, empty of the plans they had made together. They were supposed to go grocery shopping this afternoon, then meet friends for dinner tonight. Tomorrow they had planned to start painting their bathroom, a project they had been discussing for months. All of these future moments now belonged only to him, and he had no idea how to fill them alone. William found Catherine's journal on the coffee table where she had left it, and he stared at it for a long time. She hadn't explicitly told him not to read it, but something about the way she had held it told him it was private, meant only for her eyes. Still, the temptation to understand her thoughts and feelings was almost overwhelming. He walked to the window where Catherine had stood earlier, looking out at the same street she had watched while preparing to say goodbye. The world outside continued its normal rhythm. People walking dogs, children playing, couples holding hands as they strolled past. The ordinariness of life continuing around his personal devastation felt almost insulting. William tried to imagine his future without Catherine, but his mind kept returning to their shared past instead. He thought about their first kiss, their first fight, the day they decided to move in together. Every significant moment of their relationship now felt like it had been leading to this morning, to her quiet decision to walk away from everything they had built. The apartment felt too small and too large simultaneously. Too small because everywhere he looked reminded him of Catherine, and too large because her absence seemed to echo in every corner. William realized he would probably have to move, that staying in this space would be like living in a museum of their failed relationship. As afternoon sunlight began to filter through their windows, William finally approached the letter again. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the folded paper, feeling its weight and wondering how many words Catherine had needed to explain what she couldn't say out loud. He held it for a moment, then set it back down, still not ready to read her final thoughts about their life together. Evening arrived without William noticing the passage of time. He had spent the day moving aimlessly through their apartment, picking up objects and setting them down, starting tasks and abandoning them halfway through. The dinner he was supposed to attend with friends had come and gone without him calling to cancel, his phone buzzing with increasingly concerned messages that he couldn't bring himself to answer. As darkness fell outside their windows, William finally returned to the coffee table where Catherine's letter waited. The apartment felt different in the evening light, more hollow somehow, as if the day had slowly drained away the last traces of her presence. He knew that reading her words would make her departure feel final in a way that even watching her leave hadn't accomplished. With trembling hands, he unfolded the paper and began to read Catherine's careful handwriting. Her letter was longer than he had expected, filled with memories and explanations and apologies that made his chest tight with grief. She wrote about their early days together, how grateful she was for the love and security he had provided, how safe she had felt in their relationship, even as she slowly lost touch with herself. Catherine described the gradual process of her disappearance, how small compromises and accommodations had accumulated over time, until she barely recognized the person she had become. She wrote about lying awake at night feeling like a stranger in her own life, going through the motions of happiness while feeling increasingly empty inside. The letter was full of love for him, but also full of a sadness that broke his heart to read. She explained that leaving felt like the only honest choice she could make, both for herself and for him. Catherine wrote that he deserved someone who could love him without losing herself, someone who could build a life with him from a place of wholeness rather than need. She assured him that their relationship hadn't been a failure, but rather a beautiful chapter that had taught them both important things about love and partnership. The letter contained practical information too. The address where she would be staying temporarily, instructions for handling their shared accounts, a request that he not try to contact her for at least a month while they both adjusted to their new reality. Catherine asked him to take care of their plants, to keep the small herb garden she had started on the kitchen windowsill alive if possible. Near the end of the letter, Catherine wrote about her hopes for both of their futures. She expressed her belief that this painful ending would eventually lead to better beginnings for both of them. She encouraged him to pursue the dreams he had set aside, To rediscover the parts of himself that had gotten lost in their routine just as hers had, Catherine wrote that she would always love him, but that sometimes love meant letting go. William read the letter 3 times before setting it down, each reading revealing new layers of pain and understanding. He could see now that Catherine's decision had been made with careful thought and genuine care for both of them, even though it felt devastating from his perspective. Her words helped him understand that this wasn't about his failure as a partner, but about her need to find herself again. He walked to their kitchen and looked at the small herbs growing on the windowsill. Basil, thyme, and rosemary that Catherine had planted with such enthusiasm just months ago. The plants were thriving, their leaves green and fragrant, completely unaware that the person who had nurtured them was gone. William touched the soil gently and promised Catherine, wherever she was, that he would keep them alive. The apartment felt different now that he had read her letter, less like a crime scene, and more like a place where something meaningful had ended with dignity and love. William began to see their belongings not as painful reminders, but as evidence of a relationship that had been real and valuable, even if it couldn't continue. He picked up his phone and finally listened to the voicemails that had accumulated throughout the day. His mother's concerned voice, friends wondering why he hadn't shown up for dinner, his sister asking if everything was okay. William realized he would need to start telling people what had happened, would need to begin the process of rebuilding his life as a single person. For the first time since Catherine left, William felt a tiny spark of something that wasn't quite hope but wasn't despair either. Maybe it was acceptance or maybe just exhaustion, but he found himself able to imagine getting through tomorrow, and then the day after that. He thought about Catherine's suggestion that he take up photography again, and wondered if he still had his old camera somewhere in their storage closet. As he prepared for bed in their apartment that was now just his apartment, William found himself thinking not about what he had lost, but about what Catherine might find in her journey toward rediscovering herself. Despite his pain, he realized he genuinely hoped she would find the happiness and authenticity that had eluded her in their relationship. The bed felt enormous and empty when he lay down, but William managed to sleep, dreaming of mornings that didn't hurt and futures that held possibility. In his dreams, Catherine was happy and whole, and he was learning to be both of those things too. When he woke the next morning, the sun was shining through their windows, and for the first time in 24 hours, William felt like he might eventually be okay. The letter lay folded on his nightstand, and he knew he would read it many more times in the days to come. But for now he got up and made coffee for one, watered Catherine's herbs, and began the slow process of learning how to live alone again. Outside his window, the world continued its eternal rhythm, and William realized he was still part of it, even though everything had changed.